All right, so in this video, I'm going to talk about James Q. Wilson's essay against the legalization of drugs. He provides a very different argument from Thomas Saz, who was for the legalization of drugs. And James Q. Wilson's perspective is really coming from kind of the law enforcement perspective with his experience with law enforcement. And he returns to 1972 when Nixon declared that we're going to have a war on drugs. And he basically says that after that, as a consequence of this war on drugs, as a consequence of harsher restrictions and harsher punishment for people, heroin use decreased a lot. And it decreased because there was a high cost, there were a lot of penalties surrounding its use. With respect to the law, and it's also just really bad for people's health. So that decreased. And he talked about how Great Britain had temporarily legalized heroin, and it was terrible. There was a lot of corruption involved, doctors exploited it, and addiction increased as a consequence of legalizing something as potent and dangerous as heroin. And he says there was like a drug culture that emerged. So there are obviously direct consequences to legalizing something versus making it illegal. And we need to address that and acknowledge that. Now he moves on to talk about, from heroin to talk about cocaine, which is a much more in his perspective, a much more dangerous and lethal drug. And specifically, he talks about crack cocaine and the crack cocaine epidemic. And he says that crack is worse because while heroin makes people kind of passive and apathetic and they don't care, he says crack makes people aggressive, and there's like the super intense euphoria that's short, and people continuously crave that euphoria. And so it leads people to be more violent. And then he talks about the epidemic of quote unquote crack babies and how the impact of crack cocaine upon the fetus is absolutely terrible. So it's an example of how he says crack dehumanizes everyone involved, and it's a much more lethal drug. It's not a victimless drug like perhaps a more lethal or a more passive drug like heroin might be. And while Thomas Saz's argument was all about how we are individuals and we are autonomous, James Q. Wilson is saying, no, we aren't a collection of autonomous individuals. We do live in a society, and so our actions all impact one another. And therefore, we can't just say, oh, well, I'm going to take drugs, and my choice to take drugs or my decision to take drugs is not going to impact other people, because it does. It just inevitably does, because we live in a society, and we aren't just a collection of autonomous actors or autonomous individuals. So he talks about how, people have been really defeatist about the war on drugs, and he says we haven't lost the war on drugs, right? He talks about heroin earlier and how that decreased, and he also says that cocaine, isn't as common as it used to be in the 1970s or 1980s in terms of like the quality cocaine that he talks about. And he says that heroin has obviously also been contained. So no, we haven't completely lost the war on drugs. It has had an impact. And he says that there are so many benefits to making some sort of drug illegal. Yes, of course, there's going to be people who take it. There's going to be people who exploit the system. But at the same time, there are less people who end up taking drugs because of something being illegal. And so sometimes the argument is that, well, no, give people more treatment, give people more treatment and decriminalize the drug. And James Q. Wilson says that sounds nice, but treatment isn't always long term. So he says that sometimes people choose treatment or seek it out as a short-term solution, and they go back to taking the drugs. And so he says without that kind of punitive punishment measure that's taken, right, people are not necessarily inhibited or prevented from taking drugs just with the treatment model. And so legal compulsion can actually help people stay in programs. It can help people continue to be in these rehabilitation programs because they are afraid of breaking the law and being punished. So they're more likely to continue to seek that treatment than if there was no sort of legal compulsion involved. And he also says that a lot of the drug education programs that have been taught in schools wouldn't be effective without the legal side to it. So you can have DARE programs and tell people not to take drugs and that drugs are bad for you, but if they're legal, then that wouldn't carry much weight. So the fact that we have these drug education programs and that these drugs are illegal, right, that carries weight, and that prevents more people from taking drugs. And he also says that, yes, this is a moral issue, and that drugs do impact people. Mind-altering drugs impact people, and they impact how they treat other people. And so because it is a moral issue, there should be some sort of connection to legality, right? Because our actions do impact one another. So we can't just say that, oh, well, my choice to take a drug isn't impacting someone. It's not a victimless crime, as he talks about, right? It directly impacts people. And he uses alcohol as an example, because I think alcohol is an interesting case since it is legal, but it's not healthy. It's not, people can be very violent and aggressive, and it is highly addictive, or at least compared to some other drugs, it's highly addictive. So he says with alcohol, yes, there is a social harm to legalizing something. When you legalize something, you send a message out to society and convey that, okay, this is a moral thing to do. This is a permissible thing to do. So just in terms of thinking about our societal attitude about alcohol, right? We think of it as like a way to, in American culture, we think of it as a way to de-stress, as a way to party, etc. And so would we think of it this way if it wasn't legal, if it wasn't easily accessible? So when you make something legal, you are making a moral judgment about it to the rest of society and saying, hey, this is okay. And it is, and he says it has been difficult to contain the whole alcohol problem. But he says that the government can manage problems associated with alcohol much more easily than problems that are associated with crack cocaine, for example. And when it comes to addictive behavior, there has to be a really intense personal commitment to changing it. And he says that can be really difficult given different circumstances that people have, whether they don't have access to rehabilitation programs, or they're experiencing poverty, or there's just a lot of circumstances that can prevent people from really wanting or being able to stop being addicted to something or turn to drug addiction as a way to cope. So once a drug gets legal, is legal in general, of course the use of it is going to increase. He says that's not just a fact, or that's not just something that occurs. It is causation, and we desire pleasure. So of course, if something that is quote unquote pleasurable is legal, then we're going to do it, and then the use of it is going to increase because we desire pleasure. We are pleasure seeking animals, and so certain drugs do lead to the widespread degradation of humanity, of the human personality. He really believes that intensely about crack cocaine. And he says it violates, it changes us. And so the human character is not just created or formed individually, it is constructed by the society that we live in. And that's something that we need to admit. So human character is influenced not just by ourselves, but by the society we live in, by the laws, by the morals, by the norms and traditions. So we can't ignore that when it comes to discussing drug addiction. And therefore he believes that what is immoral should be mandated by law, specifically something like drugs, where it's not a victimless situation.